Everything you thought you knew about human evolution is wrong. Who are we? Where did we come from? What lies in our future? If you follow our videos, you already know that we have been lied for centuries, but a very few dare to explore the biggest lies and frauds in our human history. Actually, this is exactly what is going to happen today in the new episode of Secret Origins. Welcome.
Evolution. Few scientific theories are so widely accepted as the one claiming humanity descended from apes a few million years ago. Most people are taught this at school. It's a fact, a universal truth. Except it isn't. Darwin himself had serious doubts about his theory and expected new discoveries to either corroborate it or help it develop a better model. None of this happened. For the past 200 years, mounting evidence has proven over and over that evolution doesn't work as they tell us, but at the same time, everyone who criticizes the theory of evolution is quickly censored, persecuted, and silenced.
What happened after Darwin died that made it so dangerous to challenge his theory?
Darwin published his book on the origin of species in 1859. Before that, the most common explanation of the history of the world came from the Bible. The Irish Church Archbishop James Ussher even went so far as to specify the date and time the world was created, exactly at 9 a.m. October 23, 4004 BC. This date was calculated from carefully reading the biblical record that started with Adam and Eve and was considered scientific before the 19th century.
It was thought that everything that existed in the world, including all animal and human species, had been created at once by the Almighty God of Scriptures. But in the 18th and 19th century, some doubts began to appear.
Explorers started to unearth bones that did not seem to belong to any known species and in fact looked very old. Some church spokesmen tried to save the biblical interpretation by proposing that some animal species could have perished during the Great Flood. They were called pre-diluvian as they were thought to exist before the deluge, but scientific studies told a different story. These fossilized bones were millions of years old, not thousands. Another explanation was much needed. Naturalists also began to doubt the biblical story of an all-knowing God who created everything from scratch, especially since some animals seem to be related to others like parents to a child.
British biologist Charles Darwin wrote in his personal diary in the 1840s,
"I look upon all human feeling as traceable to some germ in the animal."
At the same time, during the 1800s, the discovery of strange skeletons like Peking Man, Neanderthal Man, and other similar findings made headlines throughout the world as they look like a mixture between humans and other primates. The scientific community in Europe was shocked, and Charles Darwin took it upon himself to seek answers outside of Europe. He embarked on a long voyage around the world that is now famous. During his travels on the HMS Beagle, Darwin noticed remarkable variation among living things, particularly in some birds called finches found in the Galapagos Islands.
This sparked the question of how such diversity arose. Darwin proposed that more individuals are born that can survive, and those with traits best suited to their environment have a higher chance of passing those traits on. Over generations, this survival of the fittest leads to gradual change, with populations adapting to their surroundings.
Darwin's theory published in his 1859 book on the origin of species, challenged the prevailing view of fixed, unchanging species. It provided a powerful explanation for the diversity of life and laid the groundwork for modern evolutionary biology. It was full of errors, but that was okay. It's just how science is supposed to work.
What Darwin couldn't imagine is that his preliminary findings would soon be used to justify senseless killings and to control the population of the world. Directly derived from Darwin's theory of evolution is a discipline called eugenics.
In Greek, the prefix eu means good and genus stands for origin. Eugenics is the science of selecting the right genes in order to ensure a good origin for new individuals. This was nothing new in our world, as genetic improvement of the human population was already achieved by the Anunnaki at the time of the Great Flood. Thanks to this, they produced a race of beings that was able to build a large advanced civilization in Egypt and Mesopotamia, later expanding to the whole world. However, eugenics in the 20th century did not imply an improvement in human life. On the contrary, it meant the extinction of human life for those considered to be inferior. Since Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, the enthusiastic geneticists in the Nazi Party loudly proclaimed the superiority of the genes of the so-called Aryan race. As a result, millions were killed. In the USA, England, Sweden, Germany, etc., societies were created to support eugenics, as well as to support research on hereditary diseases. Of course, this was just an excuse to exterminate undesired populations.
In Germany, sick people, people with disabilities, the elderly, those suffering from tuberculosis, homeless people, and alcoholics were killed in the name of science of evolution. Unscrupulous men in white robes decided who was worthy of reproducing and who would be forcefully sterilized.
In Germany, forced sterilization laws were applied 360,000 times. In the USA, 31,000 people were sterilized, and in Sweden, 12,000. In the 1950s, American doctors targeted sick people and those with disabilities, and later mainly criminals and African Americans. In Finland, forced sterilization was not repealed until 1979, and in the Swiss canton of Vaud, it remained in force until 1985.
At what cost was the question? All this was done in the name of evolution. Now, it is clear that there are powerful and sinister interests behind the diffusion of the evolution theory. We are told that we are the result of millions of years of natural selection, thus only the best genes have survived, which means we are the pinnacle of creation. But honestly, looking at the state of the world, the extent of poverty, and the number of wars, it is hard, very hard, to believe that this is true. We are taught that the men and women who lived before us were primitive, and that there is no point in reading about them or studying their teachings because they have nothing to teach. But as you and I know very well, this is a big lie.
Take, for example, the case of James Watson and Francis Crick, two molecular biologists working at the University of Cambridge. In 1953, they published their first papers on the structure of DNA, the polymer that, according to evolution, has all the genetic information and instructions for creating our organism. What they discovered completely revolutionized the world of biology. They were the first modern people to understand the structure of DNA. They described it as a double helix, For this, they were hailed as heroes and even received the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1962. Now, when looking at the history of humankind, their discoveries were not revolutionary or even new at all. Many ancient civilizations knew the double helix and even left hundreds of texts explaining that this structure was key to understanding our origins. The ancient Sumerian god Ningishzida was commonly symbolized by a double helix composed of two intertwined snakes, and a similar symbol became the caduceus of Hermes in Greek mythology.
This was interpreted already in antiquity by Jewish scholars during the Babylonian captivity as a very powerful metaphor of the origin of humankind. So what Watson and Crick were so happy to discover was actually something that ancients knew 6,000 years ago. In one word, evolution as it is explained today is the main reason our society does not evolve. Think about that.
We are purposefully kept in the dark about so many things, and there are strong interests in us not knowing the truth, especially the truth about our origins as species. Claims about the superiority of the contemporary human beings over our predecessors and about the disappearance of so-called primitive organisms are closer to propaganda than to scientific truth. Just by looking around, we can see that primitive forms live side by side with more advanced ones. The Darwinists, for instance, once declared that a primitive fish, the coelacanth, had been extinct for the last 70 million years. But quite surprisingly, the coelacanth has since turned up alive and well in the waters of South Africa, unchanged from fossilized forms hundreds of millions of years old. In the same way, the fact that primitive men exist in the past or in the present does not prove that civilized men are a recent development. The evidence found by paleontologists such as Louis Leakey in Africa within the last decades shows how more advanced humans lived at early periods, while less developed human species lived later. There is no real evidence of higher forms evolving from lower ones.
Many of the discoveries made by archaeologists must be taken with a grain of salt. In India, for example, the tradition and ancient method of disposing of the dead has always been to cremate the bodies, thus leaving no evidence for paleontologists to speculate.
The result of this is that to an archaeologist, only primitive peoples lived in the subcontinent in antiquity. On the contrary, and we know this thanks to the existence of written texts and impressive architecture, those primitive people lived side by side with the much more advanced Vedic culture, which did not leave bones behind. The standard or synthetic theory of evolution owes much to the guesswork of well-intended archaeologists who simply did not have enough evidence to really understand what they were looking at.
But also, and this is more serious, to lies, hoaxes, and deceptions.
As soon as Darwin published his book, the scientific community tried to find more evidence to support his theory. They were happy to finally have arguments against the creationists. Truth did not matter much to them as long as the evidence pointed to the results they expected.
Darwin became canonized, and the gospel of evolution was repeated over and over and over in books, rented theaters, and universities.
One of the regular followers of Darwin was German naturalist Ernst Haeckel, who was famous for his beautiful illustrations of living creatures. He was highly respected, too, so nobody at the time doubted his intentions. When he started publishing illustrations of the embryological stages of vertebrates in a series of books between 1868 and 1908, scientists were amazed at the similarities between the embryons of different species. His theory was that all vertebrates share a common ancestor and that our embryonic development repeats our evolutionary past. The only problem with this was that the drawings were a fraud. They did not accurately represent the embryos of living animals, but were fabricated by Haeckel so that they resembled each other.
Actually, if you look at Haeckel's drawings, it is almost incredible that someone believed them to be true. Michael Richardson, a lecturer and embryologist at St. George's Hospital Medical School, London, wrote,
"This is one of the worst cases of scientific fraud. It's shocking to find that somebody one thought was a great scientist was deliberately misleading. It makes me angry. What Haeckel did was to take a human embryo and copy it, pretending that the salamander and the pig and all the others look the same at the same stage of development. They don't. These are fakes."
This hoax was only discovered in the early 20th century, and doubts started mounting.
If the theory of evolution was so solid, why did the scientists need to lie about it? So, the scientific community decided that drawings were not good evidence, as they could be easily manipulated by artists. But the fossil record was surely more trustworthy, right?
In 1912, British paleontologist Sir Arthur Smith Woodward made a sensational discovery when he was scouting a field together with rookie archaeologist Charles Dawson. The two claimed to have found a skull that was the missing link between man and ape. Similar discoveries had been made in Central Europe and in Eastern Africa, but never in Britain. The newspapers were quick to name the newly discovered species, Piltdown man, after the location where it was found in southern England. The skull immediately became a sensation that amazed scientific societies for the following 40 years, until it too was revealed to be a huge fabrication.
But at least it was a good one. This fake took years to make. According to experts, the skull had been buried in East Sussex sometime between 1908 and 1912. It was composed of different cranial bones, some human and some from an orangutan, as well as different types of teeth, including an elephant molar and a hippopotamus tooth.
For 40 years, the world celebrated the archaeological marvel that successfully linked man and ape, and it became famous as the first Englishman. Smith Woodward was even knighted for the discovery. However, in 1953, it became clear that it was all a lie after chemical tests showed that the different bones of the skull were from different times. Interesting how this fake was discovered just when the DNA structure was about to be announced. It's as if they needed to quickly find more evidence for evolutionary theory so people would not begin to suspect it was a fake all along. To this day, nobody knows who was or were the original creators of the Piltdown men. Woodward and Dawson became the main suspects since they were the ones who discovered the Piltdown men, but they were most probably the first victims of the hoax. Evolutionary paleoanthropologists believe that anatomically, modern humans or Homo sapiens evolved gradually from Homo erectus. They say the first Homo sapiens appeared somewhere around 100,000 or 400,000 years ago. Their cranial capacity was almost as large as that of modern humans, but had a thick skull, receding forehead, and large brow ridges like Homo erectus.
Now, this is where the theory of evolution from less developed forms to more developed organisms starts to crumble, to crack a little bit. Some of the earliest finds of Homo sapiens come from Swanscombe in England, Steinheim in Germany, and Arago in France. Because these skulls also possess to some degree Neanderthal characteristics, they are also classified as pre-Neanderthal types.
Neanderthals were a species of hominins very close to human beings, but smaller, stockier, and with a longer skull case. They are believed to have mysteriously gone extinct 40,000 years ago, but nobody knows exactly why. It couldn't have been because of poor adaptation to the environment. After all, they evolved after modern human beings. This would mean, if we believe the Darwinist theory, that they are better suited for the environment than Homo sapiens sapiens. Similar chronological problems appeared when dating the arrival of humans into the American continent. The first arrival of human beings into the New World is generally said to have occurred some 12,000 years ago, but carbon dating of rock paintings in the site of Pedra Furada, Brazil, proves that humans were making art in the jungle some 30,000 years ago. Evolutionary scientists usually claim that the reason for this gap is precisely a gap in the evidence, and that eventually more bones will be unearthed that provide the missing link.
Yet, this is extremely important. There is no reason to suppose that the fossils that turn up will be supportive of evolutionary theory. What if, for example, fossils of anatomically modern humans turned up in much older strata? Even if anatomically modern humans were found to have lived 1,000,000 years ago, that would be enough to throw out the current accounts of the origin of humankind. In fact, such evidence has already been found, but it has since been suppressed or conveniently forgotten.
Much of this evidence came to light in the decades immediately after Darwin published The Origin of Species, before which there had been no notable finds except Neanderthal man. In the first years of Darwinism, there was no clearly established story of human descent to be defended, and professional scientists made and reported many discoveries that now would never make it into the pages of academic journals. Most of these fossils and artifacts were unearthed before the discovery by Eugene Dubius of Java man, the first proto-human hominid. Java man was found in Middle Pleistocene deposits, generally given an age of 800,000 years.
The discovery became a benchmark. After that, scientists would not expect to find fossils or artifacts of anatomically modern humans in deposits of equal or greater age, but they often did.
When this happened, scientists were quick to conclude that this was impossible and tried to find some way to discredit the find as a mistake, an illusion, or a hoax. Not to mention the enormous quantities of giant skeletons found around the world. Giants have always been a taboo subject for paleontologists, who always try to hide the evidence or dismiss it as fake. Before Java man, however, reputable scientists found several examples of anatomically modern human skeletal remains in very ancient strata. They also found large numbers of stone tools of various types, as well as animal bones bearing signs of human action. Intentionally cut and broken bones of animals are usually cited as evidence for human antiquity. In the decades following the publication of Darwin's The Origin of Species, many scientists found incised and broken bones indicating a human presence in strata older than 4 million years. Opponents suggested that the marks and breaks observed on the fossil bones were caused by the actions of carnivores, sharks, and geological pressure. But supporters of the discoveries offered impressive counter-arguments. For example, stone tools were sometimes found along with incised bones, and experiments with these implements produced marks on fresh bone exactly resembling those found on the fossils. Scientists also employed microscopes to distinguish the cuts on fossil bones from those that might be made by animal or shark teeth. In many instances, the marks were in places on the bone appropriate for specific butchering operations. The most common claim by paleontologists is, however, that humans of the modern type appeared recently.
And while some of them say so in goodwill, I will find more and more evidence that most of them are just hiding the truth. But why would they lie? Think about it. Who profits from people believing these lies? In the case of evolution, it is not just one person or even a small group of people. It is our whole society that is based upon certain principles that are supported by lies. Let's take genetics, for example. The science of genetics tries to convince us that we are the result of very specific instructions contained in our own DNA. That is, we are hereditary predisposed. It is not hard to understand why those in power would want to promote this theory.
They want to convince us that they're predisposed genetically to be what we are. There is nothing we can do to change our genetic endowment. If we are to die of a heart attack at 40, there is no point suing our employer who makes us work under stress every day of the week. It was in our genes. We cannot change them. In fact, we cannot change anything because everything happens for a reason, according to science. There is no point in discussing politics and wanting to change the government and protesting against inequities. Poor people have just not evolved the right genes. The government profits from lying about evolution. Big corporations profit from having more stupid employees. And plastic surgeons profit from convincing people that the only way to change what they inherited genetically is through expensive medical procedures. Genetics tries to prove that numerous diseases are due to genes and that all we can do is prevent these diseases at a later stage of our lives. In other words, it skillfully plays on our fears because each of us is afraid of disease and death.
Another false axiom of genetics is the belief that we can fight all diseases provided we have the right genes and we can eliminate the bad ones. In theory, we could live forever, but only if the right genes are selected in our organisms. At the same time, scientists and the media convince us that we have evolved from more simple animals and thus we are more advanced than the rest.
We look down on the rest of the animals even when crows are known to possess incredible logical intelligence, being able to easily deal with puzzles that many humans struggle to solve. Dolphins have impressive communication skills and often work together to overcome danger. Of course, we are told that these are just lesser mammals. Advanced organisms like us should never unite against a common enemy. We're better off being individualists and not communicating with one another. Not even logical thinking is recommended for human beings. We should leave that for the crows. We think that by this time we can begin to understand why it is so important for the people in power that we continue to believe in evolution. It prevents us from thinking for ourselves and from questioning the state of the world. Everything is as good as it can be thanks to evolution, and everything that is not good is just because of bad genes which will be erased in the future. These comforting lies are fed to us by the governments, the media, and the advertising specialists through billion-dollar campaigns.
However, even with their billions, they cannot erase common sense. Once we start thinking for ourselves, we can realize that the axioms of genetics and evolution are easily contested, even by common sense.
For once, it is easy to see that a person consists not only of their hereditary predispositions, parents and educators, nutrition, the books read, education, friends, luck, and other factors play a role when it comes to the development of a person, as well as their health condition. Extremely accurate studies on longevity, for example, have proven that countries with a strong economy guarantee a longer life expectancy. This means that in Switzerland, Monaco, and Japan, people die on average at 81.5 years, while in Angola at 35 and in Afghanistan at 45. In countries with low crime, life lasts longer. This has nothing to do with evolution, but with specific political and economic conditions of each country.
When we learn that people with well-paid jobs live longer than the poor, are we expected to think that better jobs are offered only to people with good genes? Nonsense. The same study proves that married people live longer than those who continuously change partners. If you have a soulmate, stick with her. Stick with your love.
This does not make sense according to evolution. If this theory were right, those who breed more often and with more partners would be selected for a longer life. And not only there are differences in the lifespan of people, but also in their diseases, which supposedly are contained in our genetic information. In Japan, for example, there are practically no cases of prostate cancer, mainly because the population there eats differently than Europeans. Genes have no significance, it is the food. In the United States, famous for its fast food chains, there is an epidemic of obesity and heart diseases. For most diseases, genes are not responsible, but rather other factors. Stress at work, the death of a close person, and the loss of a job could make us all sick, and that has nothing to do with our genes.
Much harm has been done to humanity in the name of evolution and genetics, of course. Modern genetics quickly washed their hands and distanced themselves from the Nazi scientists in the past. But if we look for a second at their claimed objectives, they were the same.
Eradicating diseases, ensuring some people live longer, improving the gene pool of humanity. This has nothing to do with political choices. They are the principles contained in the science of heredity. Since Gregor Mendel, who managed to grow better wheat through genetic manipulation already in the 19th century, to use that knowledge in human beings was only the logical next step for scientists. All these considerations do not refute evolution, although it is becoming increasingly difficult to accept it as an infallible theory. It is also difficult to accept ourselves as the pinnacle of existence. As we have mentioned before, there are species that don't seem to fit the Darwinian timescale at all. For example, the African coelacanth fish is believed to have started evolving 400 million years ago and went extinct 70 million years ago. It was believed this fish was an intermediary type between fish and amphibians. However, 309 of these fish have been found alive since 1938. At the same time, species that evolved millions of years later and thus would theoretically be better adapted to the submarine environment have already gone extinct. The coelacanth is either an exception that would invalidate the theory of evolution or proof that evolution is not always for the best.
Another thing evolution cannot explain is the development of complex life forms. In any given place and time, it is always the simpler life form which are better prepared for survival.
In 2022, scientists revived a tardigrade, also known as water bear, who had been frozen in a university freezer for 30 years. Try doing that to a rat or a koala. Modern human beings cannot even endure below zero temperatures without clothes. More complex organisms are more vulnerable to extreme temperatures, radiation. So it doesn't make sense to evolve complex animals from the perspective of survival of the fittest. In fact, it's the opposite that is true. Simpler animals are always more fit to survive than complex ones. Tadpole shrimps exist today in the same exact form as 360 million years ago.
They are literally living proof that the theory of evolution is a lie, my friends. Just to be clear, I'm not claiming that evolution is not real, only that it does not work as modern evolutionists believe, and that this belief is promoted by government organizations and the media to keep people in the dark about their own agency, to sell them more medicaments, and to keep them inactive in the shadows without the knowledge of their true history and human potential.
One of the most important theses of Darwin states that development proceeds gradually. This is just an outright lie. It is a fact that evolution can also occur in very short periods. The fur of some brown animals sometimes turns white in just 2 generations when this helps their survival. For instance, when they suddenly find themselves in a region with a lot of snow, where the white color gives them greater security. Thus, the speed of evolution is sometimes amazing.
Even this fact significantly shakes Darwin's theory. We must also say goodbye to the idea that evolution proceeds linearly, as written in most evolutionist books. In fact, we can think of evolution as having a wave-like environment. This would allow the existence of highly developed cultures tens and hundreds of thousands of years ago, something which is easily demonstrable and proven in ancient texts.
This would more easily explain geographical diversity, such as the existence of very old rock paintings in Brazil, and it will make us forget about the unfortunate genealogical tree of humanity rising straight up. This will also solve a real problem of science, which trembles at every newly discovered bone, requiring a correction of the entire timeline. Scientists should acknowledge the simple fact that hundreds of thousands of years ago there were intelligent people, perhaps even earlier. It will save science the trouble of searching for the missing links, and will stop the falsifications that are made to breathe some life into an old, discarded theory. Science will no longer have to pretend that it already knows what happened 6 million years ago, because surely no one will know.
The word science will lose part of its arrogance and somehow of its false authority. Fossils were once the main support of Darwin's theory, but now they are in fact the best example against his theory of evolution. Darwin himself once said,
But just in proportion as this process of extermination has acted on an enormous scale, so must the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory.
So Charles Darwin, the originator of the theory of evolution, admitted that the incomplete fossils record puts a hole in his theory, and since the 18,000s, evidence for evolution in the fossil record hasn't improved and has painted a more detrimental picture for his theory. Indeed, there are no intermediate forms in the fossil record, only different and complete species of animals. Why did no one find any fossil skeletons with recessive or disregarded physiological traits?
The fossil record shows low complexity. Asexual life forms existed for many millions of years, and then all of a sudden complex organisms appear. This mass explosion of life is called the Cambrian explosion because it happened during the Cambrian geological era, roughly 540 million years ago. Now again, if evolution were right and very gradual changes happened over millions of years, there would surely be fossils in the ground to show this change. The explanations by the evolutionary community make little sense, and they really don't have plausible explanation for it. For the most part, they sweep it under the rug along with everything else that goes against their theory. One of the arguments evolutionists present for why are there so few Precambrian fossils found is because of the possibility that many of these creatures were soft-bodied and thus couldn't form into a fossil. Darwin is quoted saying,
No organism, wholly soft, can be preserved.
This, however, is not true. Many soft-bodied fossils, such as jellyfish and worms, have been found in the fossil record. Archaeologists have even discovered fossils of sand ripples and raindrops, as well as dinosaur stool that they call, if you don't know, coprolites.
One of the most cited pieces of evidence supporting the theory of evolution was a fossil skeleton discovered in 1974 and named Lucy. It supposedly shows a human-ape hybrid which walked upright and was regarded as the missing link scientists have been desperately searching for. However, there has been considerable debate surrounding this fossil. Some scientists say it walked upright, others say it was a knuckle walker, and others say the fossil found is too incomplete to form an opinion. Take a look at the remains that have been found.
What can you see? Well, not much, I guess. Less than 40% of the skeleton has been found, and the more important bones are missing. Wow, what a mystery. There is no skull, no hands, no feet, and only bits and pieces of other parts of the body, including a rib that was later proven to belong to a baboon.
Somehow, though there are multiple reconstructions of what Lucy might have looked like, Ernst Haeckel would be proud of these artists. These are obviously the product of imagination more than of a science, given the fragmentary and incomplete state of Lucy's skeleton. But it helps evolutionists to sell their theory. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution is highly questionable. The large number of hoaxes like Piltdown Man, Haeckel's embryos, Lucy's reconstruction, they are an eloquent proof. Why, if the evidence were so solid, would they need to lie about fossils?
Several evolutionists, as they call themselves, have been exposed as lying deliberately, inventing ancestors of ours. Some questionable skeletons have been reconstructed from small pieces of bones, often found kilometers apart. And from this handful, the notorious ape men have been made. But to this day, not a single intermediate species has been brought to light.
You may ask, who funds these scientific expeditions and research projects? Behind them, there are always governments, large centers founded by some of the richest people on earth, and churches of different creeds. Of course, the results always seem to line up perfectly with their main interests and objectives. Huge financial interests are behind the world's leading evolution theorists. These are the same interests that manipulate the world economy, science, ideas, and life in general. The nihilistic roots of evolution, the idea that there are hidden natural mechanisms that led to the current state of the world, did not come from Darwin. Long before him, it was promoted by powerful people with the aim of depressing, discouraging, and reducing the will and awareness of the masses.
This is what the theory of evolution tells you. Life has no meaning. Chaos creates order. The strong devour the weak. And there is nothing we can do to stop that.
The audacity of evolution seems boundless. Even a small child can see that various very simple microorganisms or more complex insect-like creatures, for example, haven't budged a millimeter in millions of years. We coexist with animals like crocodiles, horsehole crabs, and mosquitoes, which have remained unchanged for several millions of years. Tadpole, shrimp, lungfish, sharks. There are hundreds of examples. At the same time, we are told that evolution happens in order to adapt the changing conditions of the environment. Now, it is easy to understand that the current world is very different than it was 4 million years ago.
So why didn't crocodiles evolve? Something doesn't fit in the evolutionist picture. And why is there so much biodiversity still? If evolution were always progressive and linear, the tendency should be towards a world with few, extremely adapted species. This is not the case at all.
These curious creatures are the only species of iguanas that live next to the sea and often swim in it. When Darwin himself discovered them in the Galapagos Islands, he aptly named them marine iguanas. Now, he noticed something very peculiar. They sneezed frequently. Darwin noted this in his notebook, but couldn't explain why every iguana seemed to have caught a flu. Much later, zoologists explained that the sneezing helped expel excess salt from their bodies. Despite living by the sea, they can't process the salt in the water, which brings them several health issues. Despite this, they have been living in the same region for a long time and they do not appear to be changing. Sloths are another example of failed adaptation. They're incredibly slow, and for that reason, they're frequently victims of predators. Evolution theory explains that slow animals should not only develop in environments where no predators are present, but again, this is not the case. Jaguars, cougars, ocelots, eyelash vipers, and alligators are some of the predators that share the same jungles as the sloths.
The evolution theory also contradicts other branches of the experimental sciences, like astrophysics, for example. Listen, astrophysicists have found that the mass and the volume of the particles that conform the universe, that is, the distribution of mass in space-time, are very precise.
They must be because with very small deviations, the universe would have either collapsed or expanded and disintegrated. It is calculated that if Earth's orbit were merely a few kilometers closer or further from the Sun, all life on the planet would perish. What we call chaos is simply a larger form of order that we cannot still comprehend. Stephen Hawking has been, all his life, one of the fiercest advocates of this higher order.
There is no such thing as chaos in the universe. No accidents. Never. And how can you imagine that all the developments that led humans to their current form have been an accident?
Evolutionary paleontologists claim that in the so-called primordial soup, the most elementary microorganisms supposedly appeared by chance
2 billion
years ago. Now, they also tell us that the conditions of the world were incredibly severe, with hot oceans close to the boiling point and volcanoes spurting lava and producing heavy clouds of smoke. It was a scenery of extremely hostile to the emergence of life.
But even if we assume that somehow, by a miracle, a microorganism appeared, how did it survive? Recent experiments by some laboratories which conduct experiments in conditions that resemble those of 2 billion years ago could not synthesize a single protein. It turns out that this is not only not simple, but directly impossible.
Some scientists began to look for answers elsewhere. The panspermia theory argues that life originated in space, in spatial ices, and continuously distributed to the planets by comets and meteorites. All life on Earth comes from outer space. Of course, this contradicts the theory of evolution and is thus excluded from all scientific books. But think about it. How can life appear out of nothing by pure chance in the most inhospitable environment imaginable? And not only this, as with many of the most important discoveries that modern science has made, this was already known thousands of years ago.
It was the Greek philosopher Anaxagoras who first proposed that the universe, the cosmos, was full of life, and that life on Earth started from the fall of these extraterrestrial seeds. It makes one wonder, where would humanity be today if scientists started reading the ancient sages instead of inventing evidence to support false theories? And there are many more questions that evolution has no answer for.
Why are there so many animals living today? Where are the intermediate forms of species? How did life appear in the first place? Why did the Cambrian explosion produce perfectly formed species in such a short time? Why do so many animals seem to be unfit for their environments? How does this evolution suddenly stop for some and not for others? Why are there so many different species and some close to each other but genetically proven to be different? Like the donkey and the horse, for example. At the same time, the hippopotamus is more closely related genetically to whales than to, say, rhinoceros. There is no point in continuing when it is so clear that the theory of evolution is weak and unsteady and has not been proven adequately for the past 200 years. By this time, it becomes evident that there is not enough evidence to support it, and that future discoveries are not likely to support it either.
As mentioned earlier, the most questionable aspect of the theory of evolution is the supposedly upward development of all living creatures. As I have already pointed out today, evidence is accumulating that evolution has occurred in large leaps. It is necessary to fit into a new wave-like theory which allows for dips and climbs, and even if there was such an upward development, we may ask ourselves, who pushed it?
There is one aspect that scientists deliberately ignore because they consider it unscientific. But animals are not just senseless beings that go around randomly, just reacting to environmental challenges. Any theory of the evolution of organisms should account also for the spiritual development. The main reason why scientists avoid discussing spiritual development is because it does not conform to their upward staircase model. There are fluctuations, and many times civilizations that existed thousands of years before us developed much more advanced spiritual systems than our own. Even scientific theories have been often forgotten for millennia, like the heliocentric model, the Pythagorean theorem, or also the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus. And in modern biology, there are also several principles that are rediscovered and disguised as newly developed theories.
So, the evolution theory is a hoax, but evolution is real. Evolution for humanity and our own souls. Spiritual growth. The real question is, who is behind it? Once we move past the purely Western scientific explanations, we can begin to grasp the true nature of our appearance and place in nature.
In the Vedic literature, for instance, we find a perfect explanation of the origin of the many species from a theistic yet scientific point of view. The thesis of Darwin's time, like the mentioned Archbishop Usher, had no scientific arguments with which to defend and explain divine creation. For instance, why does life display such a varied gradation of organisms, from the simplest amobia to the complex human being? What is the relationship between animal and human life? The answers to these questions and others mentioned before are given actually in the Vedas, a collection of ancient religious texts considered the oldest scriptures of Hinduism.
According to the Vedic scriptures, the material body is only a temporary covering of the eternal soul, merely a puppet that dances for some time until the soul passes on to the next life form. This is confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita, a manual for spiritual life spoken by Krishna.
In this ancient text, Krishna explains,
As the embodied soul continually passes in this body from boyhood to youth to old age, the soul similarly passes into another body at death.
the soul, the vital spiritual spark in each material body, is thus understood to be the active principle in the cycle of birth and death. This is the aspect that is missing from the current accounts of evolutionary theory, an aspect that is replaced by chaos and chance. But the soul is a much more complex and perfect manifestation of universal forces than simple chance. Krishna also has an explanation for the soul, expressed as advice to all human beings.
Know that which pervades the entire body to be indestructible. No one is able to destroy the imperishable soul. Only the material body of the indestructible, immeasurable, and eternal living entity is subject to destruction.
Scientists have no access to knowledge of the soul through their methods of empirical observation and experimentation, because the soul is described as beyond the observable world and is thus unmeasurable by the imperfect instruments of our senses. It is easy to understand how this philosophy clashes with the upward movement claimed by the current evolutionary scientists. As the soul is eternal and never-ending, it has also no beginning. The Hindu history of the world is not linear like ours, but cyclical.
In fact, most of the world's ancient civilizations tend to think of the world's history as cyclical and composed of different ages. The Greek historian Hesiod tells us of the wonderful nature of the last golden age, when peace and plenty abounded. Hopi myths tells us of cities of gold that now lie on the bottom of the sea. Typically, ancient peoples broke the great universal cycle into ascending and descending phases, each with 4 periods.
For example, the Hindu culture tells us that when the autumnal equinox moves from Virgo to Aries, we move through the skies, ascendingly traversing the 4 ages or yugas. These are called Kali, Dwapara, Trita, and finally Satya, the Golden Age. Then we slowly decline in reverse order as the equinox completes its journey. The Greeks and other early Mediterranean civilizations knew similar periods and labeled them the Iron, Bronze, Silver, and Golden Ages. More distant cultures such as the Maya or Hopi used still other names such as worlds or suns and labeled them 4th or 5th to identify the recent epochs. A relatively modern proponent of the cyclical system was the Sanskrit sage Swami Sri Yukteswar, who lived in the 19th century and wrote the Holy Science. He calculated that the position of our solar system relative to other stars now indicates that we recently transitioned from the lowest material age, the Kali Yuga, into the electrical or atomic age, the Dwapara Yuga. In this period, it is said that we begin to see the world as more transparent as we move from unawareness of self as a physical body in a strictly physical universe towards unawareness that we are something more than just matter. We are living in a universe filled with subtle forces and energies. The technological discoveries of the laws of gravity, electricity, magnetism, and finally quantum physics, just in the last few hundred years, give this idea credence.
In the last century, physicists discovered that physical matter is not solid at all, and that these are in fact made of atoms, which are themselves constituted of 99.9% empty space. As Carl Sagan famously claimed, we are mainly made out of nothing. The little bit of matter that does exist in the heart of the proton and neutron is now thought to be principally vibrating energy. Remember that, according to the latest version of string theory developed by Stephen Hawking himself. Indeed, reality is looking more and more ethereal, just as the ancient Vedas predicted.
There is actually physical and paleontological evidence that evolution is not linear and that frequent ups and downs happen. The most compelling evidence for this is the so-called Toba catastrophe, which happened 74,000 years ago. It is thought that the volcanic eruption of Mount Toba may have caused a global winter and a population bottleneck for humans, affecting our development as species. Humans were almost entirely wiped out, and scientists have calculated that as few as 3,000 men and women may have survived the volcanic eruption.
This means that the whole population of the world now, all 8 billion people, are the descendants of just a handful primitive humans.
The Oriental teachings about cycles indicate that the present form of the world and the organisms is just a passing phase. They say the real trend is not toward a perfectly adapted organism, as evolutionary scientists claim, but toward a higher state of consciousness, where the physical becomes only a manifestation of something from the other world.
What are the following ages according to the ancient Greeks and Hindus? The Silver Age or Treta Yuga, the third age in the ascending motion of history, corresponds to the Greek age of demigods, or, according to the yogis of India, the age of divine magnetism and the mind.
The Treta Yuga is said to be the age of levitation and telepathy, a time dominated by the shamans and wizards of old, when tremendous psychic and mental abilities are common. This age also preceded us. There are countless stories about the mythical powers of the saints and sages who had these gifts. Now seen as rare, most people nowadays don't take these reports seriously or realize that we too might have this same latent ability in a higher state of consciousness. Yet, this is exactly what the ancient told us.
In fact, Christ was quoting the far more ancient Hebrew scriptures when, in the depths of the last dark age, he said, "It is not written in your law, I said, ye are gods." He himself embodied this consciousness when he said, "He that believed on me, the works that I do, shall he do also." What is the conclusion of this text? Think deeper.
The fourth stage in the cycle of time is the Golden Age or Satya Yuga. It is considered the highest form of time on Earth. If the Treta or Silver Age is inconceivable to us today, then the Golden Age must sound like a myth or a dream. The Greeks called it the Age of the Gods, and the myth and folklore of the Vedas and ancient Egypt hint that this was a time when gods literally walked the earth and most of mankind lived in perfect harmony with nature and the heavens. While there now remains very little physical evidence of this long ago period, we find that virtually every ancient megalithic construction prior to the year 1500 BC seems to be oriented towards some astronomical or cardinal point. Going back further, there are signs that multiple structures may have been aligned to mirror constellations or the larger heavens. The Golden Age is said to be a time when we could perceive and communicate with astral or other realms and directly know God without the intermediation of any religion.
Again, this sounds more like a fairy tale given our current state of consciousness, but it is a theme common to ancient peoples who spoke and wrote of long-lost higher ages. The Darwinists did not have a replacement for God as the creator of the universe. They proposed the development and formation of species was by chance, and that changes happened, well, at random. However, this answer does not explain correctly the evolution of species. We couldn't have been created by chance. It is not random.
We are often amazed by the beauty of nature, be it a landscape, a flower, or an animal. It can be argued that some animals develop beautiful plumage or fur in order to be more appealing to their own kind, thus securing breeding and hereditary transmission of traits. But why do we humans, who do not breed with the rest of the species, are able to appreciate their beauty? What evolutionary or adaptive benefit could the different types of spots in giraffes have? It is hard not to acknowledge the fact that some traits do not have any practical or evolutionary objective other than aesthetics. This all points to the existence of beings that we call bioengineers. They are the gods or instigators of antiquity. Naturally, there is no evidence for them, just like there is no bone evidence for the Vedic civilization. But to think of some impersonal evolution also contradicts our daily experience, contradicts historical science. If we suppose an evolution of the spirit independent of organisms, a number of interesting phenomena would suddenly be explained. The question of who is responsible for all this is not new.
We have been asking it for at least 6,000 years and can be sure that we will keep asking it for the next 6,000 millennia. Is there, however, a satisfactory answer? We know several myths, legends, and traditions that claim that the human race is much older than we assume today. There is hardly a nation that does not mention that there was a time where there were gods, a time before time, as they often describe it. Those same myths explain how the gods appeared on earth at the beginning of time and how they created humankind and all the beings in the world. But crucially, most of these civilizations, including the Greeks, the Japanese, the Egyptians, the ancient Indians, the Sumerians, the Germanic tribes, the Aztecs, and the Mayans, and many others never claim that the created beings remained unchanged since the beginning of times.
In some accounts, even the gods created life on earth retreated to the heavens or some other place after their creation was successful. This was the case with the Egyptians, where the god Horus transferred power and the role of Egypt to the pharaohs before retreating to the underworld, and the Anunnaki of Mesopotamia returned to their home planet Nibiru. When looking at all the different myths and legends around the world, we are sometimes amazed at how many coincidences they have and how they coincide in the main points. Then, I realized that the odd one out, the account that is different from the rest, is our Western science. Why would one think that our ancestors were all wrong about everything and the only truth comes from science and the evolutionary theory? Even if you believe in science, how many truths have later been proven wrong only to be replaced by other, more advanced truths?
If we really seek the truth, we should start by doubting everything, especially scientific knowledge. In reality, not every scientist blindly follows the evolutionary creed. There are already several serious scientists who claim that the simple descent from an ape theory leaves too many questions unanswered.
Thinking that there has been a spiritual evolution is becoming more popular even among scientists. In this case, the old theory must be supplemented with a spiritual, psychic, or mental component. There are signs that the scientific community is starting to change to be open to more esoteric and spiritual explanations of common events. It is therefore expected that in the next few years, the general consensus will move away from geneticism and the idea of linear progress from less evolved forms to more evolved ones, and toward a more wave-like model of evolutionary development. One that not only takes physical changes into account, but also spiritual ones.
Only when the real answers to the fundamental questions of life will be found. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going?
Let's return to the times of Darwin. During the 19th century, science was fascinating and revolutionary. It produced countless innovations to improve life here on planet Earth. For once, it substituted the monolithic creed of the Catholic Church that explained everything from the Holy Bible. But the Bible is a book written to transmit the words of God and not to state the laws of physics. Ever since the concept of science was invented, there have been scientists coming up with hypotheses and theories explaining how things here on Earth work, as well as other scientists coming up with different theories. The scientific community, at least in its beginnings, openly accepted competing theories which offered a better explanation than the original ones in place. This was what allowed science to progress and innovation to continue throughout history.
Unfortunately, this is not the current scenario, especially with the theory of evolution.
Since its inception in 1859, evolution has been the one and only theory for how life on Earth was formed that the scientific community promotes. There is no other theory even competing for space on the subject, and mentioning another theory is a surefire way to get excommunicated from the scientific community.
This is especially true of the Western scientific community. The panspermia theory is one of the best examples of a theory that has been silenced. A Chinese paleontologist by the name of Jun Yuan Chen once said, "In China, we can criticize Darwin, but not the government. In America, you can criticize the government, but not Darwin."
Darwinism has become a kind of a religion among scientists who fiercely defend it while trying to just ignore the data that does not coincide with it. This fierce defense is commonly attributed to the threat of the competing explanation of life on Earth: creationism. Creationism is the belief that the universe and living things were created by a divine being, typically following the account in the biblical book of Genesis. It emphasizes a literal interpretation with Earth formed in a short period and species specially designed. This literal interpretation of the scriptures is of course useless, as the Bible was never intended to be read literally.
Fortunately, there is a third possible interpretation: intelligent design. Many would link intelligent design to a Christian Judeo-God, but it doesn't have to be that way. What if other intelligent beings designed us, or it was our own collective consciousness?
We have previously mentioned these beings as bioengineers or gods, but they also fall within the category of alien beings, as they do not belong to Earth originally. The existence of alien life forms is a generally accepted fact within the astrophysicist community. And even Stephen Hawking was once quoted saying,
"I believe alien life is quite common in the universe."
This theory is much more believable than some currently accepted theories in the scientific community. However, a scientist with a reasonable explanation for how life formed on Earth cannot mention an alternative theory such as intelligent design, which actually proves to be a better explanation for life than evolution, without being slandered and ridiculed. Why is this the case? There are several examples of professors and lecturers in academia who have tried to present alternative theories and have endured harsh consequences.
Caroline Crocker was a lecturer at George Mason University in Virginia. Caroline dared mention intelligent design in her cell biology class, and her academic career suddenly came to a halt. She was fired from her position in George Mason and blacklisted in academia. After this blacklisting, she was no longer even considered for positions at other institutions, where in the past she was offered jobs on the spot after an interview. Michael Egner is currently a neurosurgery professor at Stony Brook University in New York. A high school in Virginia was having a contest with the topic "Why I Would Want My Doctor to Have Studied Evolution." In response to this, Michael wrote a post stating evolution was irrelevant to medicine, and it didn't matter if the doctor studied evolution, just as it didn't matter if they were Christian, Muslim, or atheist.
Michael immediately started receiving backlash from members of the field, including doctors, researchers, and other professors. Soon, a campaign even was started that urged Stony Brook University to force Michael to retire. Fortunately, he still works at Stony Brook and was able to keep his job even after so much backlash. However, he was forced to keep his comments to himself.
Guillermo Gonzalez was an astrophysicist professor at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. Gonzalez co-authored a book titled The Privileged Planet, which made an argument that the universe was intelligently designed. 2 years before Gonzalez was eligible for tenure at Iowa State, 130 faculty members at the university signed a petition that opposed all attempts to represent intelligent design as a scientific endeavor.
When he became eligible for tenure in April of 2007, Gonzalez's application was denied. While not specifically stated by the university, his position on intelligent design and dissent from his colleagues was most likely the cause.
The point being made is evolution may be the only theory currently preached by scientists due to fear. Fear of ridicule from their peers or backlash from their academic institutions for even mentioning something else. There may have been many more in academia who disagree with the theory of evolution, but because of this same fear, they abstain from bringing up alternative theories, and business goes on as usual. This shouldn't be the case in any scientific field. All reasonable explanations should be accepted and studied by the scientific community, as this is how science progresses. We no longer believe bloodletting cures diseases or schizophrenia is caused by demonic possessions. Progression in science has allowed us to learn more about life and the planet on which we live. Without competing theories, science stalls, and we as a society stall. This should never be the case.
The theory of evolution is mostly a fraud, hidden under the mask of science and defended solely to revive materialistic philosophy. It is a deception based not on science, but on brainwashing propaganda and falsifications. In The Origin of Species, Darwin explains this as follows.
If my theory is true, there must necessarily have lived intermediate forms that connect the species, and the evidence for their existence can only be found among the discovered remains.
When Darwin wrote these lines, he was aware that the remains of these intermediate forms had not been found. But new discoveries made the news every week, so he was confident that if these intermediate forms did exist, they would be discovered in the fossil record one day or another. This problem accompanied him on many sleepless nights, mainly because he saw that this created a deadlock for his theory. Therefore, in the chapter titled "The Difficulties of the Theory," he wrote,
If species have indeed evolved through slow improvements from other species, why do we not encounter countless intermediate forms? Why is nature not in chaos but precisely ordered, with everything in its place? There must be countless intermediate forms, but why do we not find them in any of the countless earth layers? But why can't we now discover closely connected intermediate species, given that there were transitional living conditions in the transitional periods? This obstacle has puzzled me for a long time.
Darwin's only explanation for this deadlock was that the discovered remains were insufficient. He claimed that when the discovered fossils are studied more thoroughly, the missing intermediate forms will necessarily be found. Believing in this prediction by Darwin, evolutionists from the mid-19th century onwards have searched for their intermediate forms worldwide, conducting intensive fossil research. They have tried to present some of their discoveries as evidence for their theories. Some of these discoveries have excited them, but over time, it became clear that this excitement was in vain. After 200 years of searching for intermediate forms, it is now time to put an end to the evolutionary theory as it is thought currently.
Evolution happens, just not as we were told. The current theory of evolution, which has changed very little since Charles Darwin first proposed it almost 200 years ago, is not only wrong, but it is full of lies. The truth is all out there for anyone to see. If you found this information useful and interesting, consider liking and subscribing to our channel for more. Keep your minds open. Believe in the impossible. Awaken your consciousness. Awaken your souls. Think outside the box and do not believe on the blindly presented to you pictures and news. Keep your minds open, and until we meet again.